now I want to talk about the search for the Southern Cross. We've talked about Kingsford-Smith on a number of previous occasions. He was the idol aviator in Australia, and he set off on a trip from New South Wales to England. He was going to try and break a record. He had his crew with him, which had just recently flown across the Tasman to New Zealand, not the crew that he used for the Pacific crossing, and he got lost for 2 weeks. And the aircraft that set out to look for him and found him was the Canberra. It was a giant moth that also left from Sydney, and it took a number of days to find the aircraft. And so the crew left Mascot on the 30th of March 1929 at 10:30 in the morning. They were headed for Wyndham, but they ended up getting lost at what was called Coffee Royal. That was the name that came through an event or an episode which I'll mention later on. But on board the aircraft were Charles Kingsford-Smith and his other partner, Charles Holm, Litchfield and McWilliams. McWilliams was the radio operator and the other was the navigator. Smithy had been under a lot of pressure. He was going through divorce procedures which were being dragged out in Perth. You remember he was married to Thelma Corboy, which we talked about. That was taking an extended time in Perth to get through. Also, we've talked about Smithy being in business with Keith Anderson. As they developed their ideas for the flight across the Pacific, they had Gascoyne Transport. After they'd flown with Norman Brearley and got the sack, they started the Gascoyne Transport Company. During that time, they talked about the crossing of the Pacific and the planning that went with it. After Ulm joined the group, Anderson was pushed out of the lineup, and so he sued for some money he felt that he deserved. Some of the rewards that went to Kingsford-Smith. Also, Bobby Hitchcock, a West Australian, was invited along in the group to go to USA and fly the Pacific, and he also got pushed out of the party, the group, and he sued for money as well. Both of those two lost their court case, and these two court cases took place in the weeks just before the departure. Ulm was the driving force in setting up Australian National Airways, and of course Kingsford-Smith was his partner, but developed it without having an aircraft, and this was one of the reasons why they were going to England to purchase an aircraft to fill the spots in their new company. This was causing a few problems, so Smithy was under a lot of pressure, and he submitted to the flu and spent a few days in bed prior to this episode taking place. There was also bad weather reports. There was a gentleman in Wyndham who was forwarding weather reports, and at no time did he say, yeah, things are marvellous up here. The monsoon was receding at a slow pace. The information that was being sent out by him was that the landing ground was boggy and it may dry out in a few days. And then the last one that he sent was, don't leave, it's no good. And so Smithy and Ulm, and the crew, as listed up there, left Sydney, Mascot. Strangely, that's now called Kingsford-Smith Airport, isn't it? At 10:30. They hadn't gone very far, less than an hour, when Litchfield accidentally knocked the release mechanism for the aerial for the receiver. The wireless was in two parts, a transmitter and a receiver. The aerial reeled out automatically because it hit the button. It was uncontrolled and it separated from the aircraft. So they couldn't receive any information from the ground. They made the decision to not go back and land and repair it. It would have meant jettisoning 900 gallons of fuel. And so that was the reason they gave that they didn't come back. So on they went. They made transmissions every couple of hours as to how they were going, where they were, and what the weather was like. But by the time they got to about 400 miles from Wyndham, the weather deteriorated very badly. They had no chance to get a fix, no chance to get a drift. They couldn't see the ground. And so this is a close-up of the area, and of course cloud for 400 miles before Wyndham. After their ETA, without seeing anything on the ground, they carried on. After a while they were worried that they were going to end up over the Timor Sea, and luckily, they found a hole in the clouds and went down through it. They found a settlement there which was run by the Benedictine monks. So they dropped a note, and the monks and the Aborigines at the mission didn't find the note. And so, after circling a number of times, a monk came out from a building, stood there with his arm pointing in one direction, and they thought that he'd picked up the note and was giving them directions to either Wyndham, direction to Wyndham. What in fact happened, as it turned out, the monk came out and pointed to what he thought was a reasonable landing ground less than a mile away, and he was pointing to the southwest. And of course, pointing to the southwest had them flummoxed. They had no idea that Wyndham would have been towards the southwest. But they did. They turned towards the southwest and erroneously headed in that direction. They went down the coast for a while, in cloud most of the time. Then they came to another opening and they went down through that, searched around at low level and found another mission. This one was the Port George mission. So they revised their plans on how to transfer information from the ground, and they dropped a note and said, would you lay out 3 sheets on the ground and align them in the direction of Wyndham? So the people in the mission went inside, got 3 sheets, aligned them in the direction of Wyndham, and then they dropped another note and said, using some dark coloured earth, would you put some numbers on there indicating the distance in miles to Wyndham? And they did, and they put 150 on the sheets. And so they analysed the information they got and thought, right, we'll be off to Wyndham. Once they got going, they started to analyse the data a bit more deeply, and they thought, well, if the weather's no good, we're not going to be able to see the ground. We're low on fuel. They're now 28 hours into the flight, and so they thought, well, maybe it's not a good idea to head into cloud and hope to find Wyndham. We know that we can see the ground at Port George. So they did a U-turn and headed back to Port George. It tells us that they landed at Port George after 28 and a half hours flight, and a day later. And they had very little food with them. They landed, as it turned out to be, about 15 miles away from Port George. They'd accidentally left their emergency rations behind in Sydney. They left there with 3 rounds of sandwiches each, plus coffee plus water, about, I think it was 4 quarts of coffee and 3 quarts of water. They also had on board some baby formula which they were taking for a sick child in Wyndham. So that's all they had. They had water. They could get water from their surround, and so people became worried about them after a couple of days, and for the first couple of days they did fairly well as far as eating went. They became desperate and they gathered snails. They cracked the snail shell, put the body of the snail into a pot with water and boiled it, and that became their food for some days. Their description of it involves a couple of swear words. It was on I think the Saturday, Easter Saturday, that they left Sydney. So Easter Sunday they put down, where I was just talking about, and I didn't mention the coffee royal. When Holm produced the coffee, I think it was the last flask of coffee, he also produced a bottle of brandy. So they put the brandy into the coffee, and they had coffee royal, and that's where the name came from. On the Monday, the Sun newspaper chartered an aircraft from West Australian Airways, which was flown by Jimmy Woods, and he searched around the Wyndham area, but he didn't have any firm idea of where he should concentrate his search. The flight to England was being sponsored by the Sun newspaper. They expected to get information from the flight in excess of what would be let out to other people and to other newspapers. So by this time there were arguments taking place between the newspapers as to how gallant and brilliant these people were and whether they were pulling a stunt or not. So by the 3rd, newspapers were carrying stories, and the Aircraft magazine recalled that at least a number of times Charles Kingsford, in discussion with people, had said that if you want to make a name for yourself, you might get lost. And if you remain lost for a few days, then the newspapers will start to talk about it, and this will add to your image when you are found, and this may help you with sponsorship. You might be able to get money from people to help you with your flights. This had been discussed on a number of occasions, and this was being brought up by people and published in the newspaper. The Sun, of course, was refuting it, and they sued other newspapers for the innuendo which was occurring. So it became nasty at the newspaper area. The federal government was approached for a search aircraft, and they said, no, it's a private enterprise, we don't have to do anything to help. And so in desperation a group of people got together, not the Sun newspaper, but a group of people got together and formed the Southern Cross Rescue Committee. They then approached an individual, Les Holden, who just happened to, a few days before, bought an aircraft, and that was the giant moth that we saw earlier on. And so he got a party of people together, 2 others, Stanage and Hamilton. Hamilton was a doctor, and they took off to search for the missing aircraft and people. They went by Broken Hill, Erdnadata, Alice Springs, and as they went along their route they took some photographs. And these are the photographs that I found on the internet about 3 weeks ago, and it developed my interest in this whole subject. And so in the main, what follows is the photographs taken by the people on board the Canberra or the giant moth. The captions underneath are those that came with the photography. And so that's the aircraft at Erdnadata on April the 6th. Remember, Smithy left on the 30th of the month. And so this is 6 days later that they're in Erdnadata. They got to Alice Springs. And some people can tell that is Alice Springs by the break in the McDonald Ranges there. Anyone remember that? Yeah. And some Aborigines came out to sit under the wing and see what was going on and have a bit of a rest. And there we find we've got chap in the light jumper is Les Holden there, and the bloke in the coat is the doctor, Dr. Hamilton. I don't know what the others were doing in the episode. They say that they used the petrol from the Cobham flight. I don't know whether I'd like to be using petrol. As far as I know, Cobham was about 2 years before all this. And you would have thought that this bloke here would have put some clothes on. But these are photographs of life, real life, out in the outback, and this is what attracted me. And there are a couple of other photos which really impressed me, and that's the reason why I'm showing them. I don't know whether you can see it, but no, it's very hard to see, but there are flies on his back all over the place. They're driving people mad. I've been out in this sort of condition, and some of you would have too, that every time you brush your hand in front of your face, you'd hit a dozen or two dozen flies. It's a line-up of Aborigines at Wave Hill, and note the terminology, they're talking about bucks or the blokes. We don't seem to hear that term anymore. And they refer to the females as gins. We don't use that term anymore. Are we allowed to? We're not allowed to. Okay. Someone was quite firm about that. Anyway, these are captions from 1929 when they were using the terms freely and openly. I think that's a great shot. That is a female Aborigine with her pickaninny on her shoulders. That's what attracted my attention. That's what started me moving along this line. That's a photograph of Wyndham, so they finally got there on the 8th. So it wasn't a bad time. The bit furthest away from me is the Wyndham Meatworks, and the bit closest to me is the town, the pub, etc. The man who was providing the weather forecasts was Clive Chatto, and that's Clive Chatto holding up the bag on the left-hand side there, showing the food that they've got, which they will drop off to the missing people, the missing flyers, when and if they find them. There's a photograph of Wyndham town site again, and the bastion in the background. Just a point there, I find a lot of people talking about the bastion or the bastions. The word bastion comes from Europeans using the word bastion instead of Sebastian. The full name Sebastian is contracted, not in Australia by Australians, but by people in Europe. That was what the 6 Mile pub was like in 1929. It's changed a lot since then. Still has good meals and nice drinks. Some of the Aborigines from Forest River Mission came and had a look to see what was going on. And that was the equipment they had on the Canberra, and there's a lot there. If you can see that this is the axe handle and this is the axe blade. You can see that this is the stock of the rifle here. This is a radio. This is probably the doctor's bag, and these are provisions, food and water. So that was what was carried. They were really impressed by seeing a camel train at the airport, and that's them taking on fuel which had been positioned for the Southern Cross. And that's them having lunch on the 10th. I can only assume that they didn't take any photographs on the days when they were searching, but I'm sure that as soon as they got to Wyndham at their first opportunity, they were searching for the missing aircraft and people. On the 12th, In their search they found some smoke, and they went straight to it, had a good look at it. They expected to find the downed airman there, but no one there. So they continued their search. And lucky for them, they found the aeroplane. You can see it over there. Another shot of it, and you can see the tracks left by the undercarriage there, and it probably came to a bit of a shuddering halt by comparing the tracks to the attitude of the aircraft. This is what the countryside was like. To have an engine failure or run out of fuel over that wouldn't be very nice. The black or darker areas are mangroves, and the lighter areas are mudflats. And you'd want to stay away from both of those if you were performing a landing. Smithy chose something over this area here to the right and did a good job. He got the aircraft down and everyone was safe and sound, and that's very important. They made their announcement on the radio, so the news was out that found them. They dropped off supplies and they went back to Wyndham, and they reckon that half the Wyndham population showed up at the airport to greet them. They were so happy. In subsequent days, on the 13th of April, and this is 2 weeks after the aircraft left Sydney, another aircraft flew in, piloted by a man called O'Day, Tommy O'Day, and he took this photograph. This caused a bit of an uproar when it was published, because the Sun newspaper was putting out that these men were emaciated, they were thin, starving, nearly dead. And when you look at that, it's not quite so. The story about Ulm saying, get yourself lost, get a bit of newspaper coverage, resurfaced again. Part of that incident, another aircraft had landed, flown by Bertie Heath, and he had on board a reporter from the WA newspaper. And Ulm took him to one side and said, I'm going to tell you what happened here, but I don't want you to spread this news to anyone but the Sun newspaper. It must go to the Sun. Later on, Ulm took O'Day and Bertie Heath to one side and asked them to sign a document. And the document was a summary of what had happened to them. Bertie Heath said, I'm not signing that. What you're getting me to sign is nothing like what I've observed and heard in discussions. And O'Day said, I'm not signing it like that. I want modifications made. Will you alter it? And then I will sign it. So Ulm made alterations. All of this was adding to the fire that was taking place between newspapers. Gives a fairly good idea of what things were like on the ground there. And then they started their trip home. They weren't in a hurry to come home, and I thought they could have done another job because there was something else going on in the background which I haven't mentioned so far. But here they are, a week after they found the aircraft, and they're on their way home. They weren't very happy with Flora Valley. That's the kitchen and the dining room, and all they had to eat was beef and bread for 4 days. So they weren't in a hurry to do anything or get anywhere, and that's a little bit confusing. There's some Aborigines working on their landing ground, working sometimes, as you can see if you read that. There's the Aborigines on the floor, and that's a classic photo, don't you think? I think that's marvellous. Brilliant photo. Staged, no doubt, but a real ripper. You'll see the Canberra there in the foreground and 3 other aircraft. They were Royal Australian Air Force aircraft that had been moseying around the countryside, but they'd been boiling and they'd been bursting their tyres, having trouble with their undercarriage, and so they were virtually holed up at Wave Hill, going nowhere. That's a classic photo of an Aborigine at Nullarbor. That's a photo on the 23rd of April of the crew of the Canberra meeting Smithy who was on his way home. Both aircraft were on their way home to Sydney. They eventually got there on the 27th. But as I said, there was something going on in the background. The Kookaburra, Anderson and Hitchcock, had taken off the day after the Canberra, went via Broken Hill, Oodnadatta, Alice Springs, and then they had an engine failure on the Tanami Desert and went down on the 10th. So if you start thinking about the numbers and dates that we've talked about, at least 2 aircraft were in the area, could have done something about it, but didn't. They had fairly good reports on where the aircraft had been, Alice Springs, and they knew because the crew, Anderson and Hitchcock, had left notes in the police station that they were travelling direct to Wyndham, and they didn't make it. And so it proved very difficult to get a search aircraft to go out and look for these people. Finally, an aircraft was hired in Brisbane and flown to the Tanami Desert, and it eventually found this aircraft. A pitiful performance by people in the aviation industry, as far as I'm concerned. So on the 25th they got to Longreach, then they got home. A couple of extra photos, nothing to do with what I've been talking about, but I find them to be classics. This is how they graded the aerodrome at Burke. A couple of circles of metal. You can see there, there's metal there and here, being towed behind the truck. And there they are, standing up. So that was the means of grading an airport in those days. So when the aircraft both got back to Sydney, there were photographers all over the place taking photographs of both crews, the Canberra and the Southern Cross. All people safe and sound. But when the details of the suffering of Anderson and Hitchcock were made public, sadness swept the country. And the heroes who had been written up in the papers in previous months as great aviators were now under a microscope, and the microscope was starting to burn them. Newspapers locked horns and sued each other as to who was right and who was wrong, and the innuendo, magazines, aircraft, etc. had published stuff which was downright wrong. So in contrast to the euphoria when the Southern Cross was found, there was a distinct, subdued reception by some people. And so court cases followed where they had 75 witnesses come and give evidence about how it all fitted together. 3 people fronted up at the inquiry and said, I personally heard Charles talk about getting lost for a particular reason. There were many other flies in the ointment, you might say. If you need to know anything more about this, the book called Smithy by Ian McKersey is without doubt the best one put together. It covers the details very nicely. The other books that I've got and have read gloss over things very, very quickly. You know, they might give a paragraph or part of a paragraph to one of the very salient points which have ended up with deep discussion by McKersey. So there we are. That's the display of some photos that took my attention, taken by the crew of the Canberra, and a background story of